Okay, so Bonnie, we will discuss your answer to the question, what is your working definition of awakening and enlightenment? So I will ask them questions, and Tim, our invisible participant from England, will ask them questions. So Tim, do you have any questions?
Yeah, actually, I found, so you've given your definitions of awakening and enlightenment, and awakening was, for me, very clear. Like, it's very, like, authentic, self-authoring, individuated, being how it relates to the tradition, spiritual tradition over 2,000 years, what's kind of, not new or different, but it's very, very clear. When you shift it to enlightenment, to me this sounded less like a definition and more like somewhat of a, forgive me for saying, a vague, almost statement of purpose, in a sense. So we're beginning to doubt the reality of experience itself, and you're pointing out kind of very Kantian metaphysical kind of truth in the sense, whatever, almost like camera work, like whatever you're filming alters the nature of the object or subject being filmed. So, and because this is changing over, let's say, a 2,000-year span, the kind of quality of the data that we extract from our own personal experience is altered as well, inevitably. And so this is kind of a problem, but for me, unless I missed it, this isn't really a definition. It's almost like a statement of problem.
So the question is, do I have a working definition of enlightenment as a thing? See, this is one of the tricky things about these two words. Awakening is a process. Enlightenment is a noun, and there's a sense in which that the goal is a clear, there's something at the end of the path. There's a tape or a ribbon that you cut through and you're there. There's a goal. There's a discrete experience that constitutes the term, right? And now I could give you one of, I could name key features that I would say tick off to see if I would say someone is enlightened, or to what degree is someone enlightened. But I don't relate to that word as a thing or an object or a completion that that any kind of completed process. So unless you take, I certainly can understand that there are traditional definitions, and I can say, well, let's take the traditional definition of enlightenment. But the question was, what is my definition of enlightenment? And as far as my definition is, there is no final resting place for that project. There could be degrees. I have markers or features of where I could say, well, this person is more or less enlightened. He's got this covered, he's got that covered, but he really doesn't have this covered, for example. So what's a marker? For me, a lot of the markers in the Enlightenment Project are deeper versions of what's in the Awakening Project. So, for example, in Awakening, there's a process, we'll use some traditional language here, of deconstructing the ego, understanding the ego is a conditioned construct, and moving past that, okay? So, I'm not trying to get too hung up on examining that proposition. But there can be some subtle residue, so you're no longer referencing the ego, but you still have a referencing problem. You're still referencing experience relative to something else. You could be referencing experience relative to, am I enlightened or not? So in the Enlightenment Project, then the act itself of referencing experience has to be burnt through. right? So it's the absolute version of the referencing problem in the Enlightenment Project that has to be, disembedded from. So there's a lot of that gets, the Awakening Project deals with actual life experiences that can be improved by learning how to disembed, disattach, disentangle, make distinctions in your life. In the Enlightenment Project, you're working with the ultimate versions of those, the very last subtle versions of those kinds of attachments, assumptions, implicit metaphysical meaning making that you have. And so we can spend time on that, and I can go through many features of what I think is in the Enlightenment Project, but I don't think that there's, then all of a sudden, you are enlightened. I think that we're always clearing house, we're always removing some kind of implicit assumption and allowing something new to arise, and there's always the danger, and then we investigate that, we reference that, and we build on that, and then we have to move through that frame of reference. There's always a process of both deepening the excavation or the mining of the attachment, let's just use that word, and widening the new possibilities that come in from the larger space of awareness. And so to me, there's no end to that. That's what I call the Enlightenment Project.
So if you can give like one or two sentences, because I'm still not clear exactly what the difference is between autonomy or autonomous and agent or agency.
Okay. So I'll give you examples, right? So the fully individuated Zen monk in the cave is completely autonomous.
Okay.
But he has no agency in the world.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
It's actually, there's no it doesn't brought that autonomy into agency in the world and participate with other human beings, participate with, he could be doing fabulous gardening, I'm making a stereotype,
Sure.
but this would be someone who has no relationality
Yes.
and no agency.
I see.
Right?
I see.
So I would say that person could have a lot of features of enlightenment, but is not awakened. He is not a full awakened as a full human being, in my definition.
So, okay, so this is kind of like, I can argue that the way you define awakening can simply be substituted with the psychological definitions of a healthy human being. So,
Well, okay.
okay, that's my first question. And the second question is, in 21st century, there are some teachers who do both so-called psychological work and spiritual work, and say it's the same process. So, but they don't really explain what makes it a same process. Like, do you have to do psychology work before you do spiritual work, or vice versa? So, if you applied ontological look between awakening and enlightenment, is there some kind of asymmetrical relationship that we should be aware of?
Yes. So if we're going to frame the question that way, then this is something we talked about yesterday, and you had asked it to me directly, and that is, we said, why, when people realize that no one's holding the master blueprint for the future, why is that frightening? And we said, well, a lot of people, unless you're Woody Allen, aren't frightened about it because it's the conceptual version of that, right? But they are frightened by the actual manifestation of assuming that someone's holding the blueprint in their very life. They get little peaks in their life that what they assume to be true what they assume is making meaning in their life is actually empty of meaning, empty of interpretation, empty of, substance in the way. And so they have these little neurotic responses to that in their life. So that would be their part of their authenticity project. So in a sense, we can say in many cases enlightenment is an iteration of authenticity, but at an ultimate level.
Okay.
So ideally, and from an ontological standpoint, they tumble over each other, right? Because
Okay.
sometimes I'm trying to fix my authenticity project, I'm trying to become more free of my egoic desires, but I'm still referencing something, and I realize that I still think, and then finally I realized that my orientation to my problem, even though I'm burnt through my parents' problem, my partner and I are functioning well, my basic orientation is still that someone is going to come and give me the answers to my problems.
Okay.
I haven't even concretized who that someone is, but I finally realized my orientation to that is not really changed. I've snookered myself. I've somehow thought, well, in the end, life holds itself together and nature knows what's going on or something. I've substituted a very subtle refuge instead of my daily life ones. Once I start to ask questions on that deeper level, this deep, more what grounds my actual experience, then I'm starting to work more in the enlightenment stage. But then that can help me then translate into my life. So I call it tumbling over each other.
Yes.
I think the greatest danger we have today, it's nice that the Eastern traditions and this whole Enlightenment project has gotten very popular, but I think that if anything, people are way into the metaphysical analysis of ultimate reality and kind of skip through the whole awakening process. And so you have people that are doing very high conceptual investigation and phenomenological explorations of non-ordinary experiences, but there's no bridge to their actual day-to-day life, which is just a manifestation, an actual manifestation of these more esoteric ways to explore that.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the difference between awakening and psychological is that in psychological, there's kind of assumption of endpoint. If you're psychologically healthy, let's say you don't have to do anything more. When you're saying no, awakening,
Right.
therefore, is different from psychological, because the more enlightened you are, somehow there's a more that can come out of it, show up in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, awakening is not different than Buddhist psychology. The Buddhist psychology has esoteric practices.
Yes.
But conventional psychology is normative within your cultural values.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I said about awakening is you have to be fully individuated
That's right.
from your cultural conditioning. And so, a psychotherapist is not really, if they're ethical, they're not really interested in fixing your coping mechanisms, the mechanisms that you use to cope as an ordinarily sane person in your culture. But in awakening, you actually see that ordinary coping mechanism is basically crazy. There's no basic sanity in our ordinary coping mechanisms when we appropriate conventional socially conditioned norms. So awakening in the autonomy aspect of it requires us to pierce through social conventional conditioning. And the definition of basic sanity now is not coping within this crazy kind of system, but coping as an autonomous individual. So, there is Buddhist psychology that has that definition of sanity, but conventional psychology is not that. work at all.
So agency could imply a possibility of world transformation at that point, because you are now changing the culture as opposed to being held by the culture.
Exactly.
Okay, I see.